Hey, folks, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio. And as I always say, a big thank you to all of you who have been watching my videos, who are talking all about the Beatles here on this channel, and to all of you who have subscribed as well. And on my show this time, I've got two pals of mine, and you know them pretty well, Tom HUNYADY and Andy Nichols, who both do the Paul McCartney podcast called Two Legs. And they have been as busy as ever with so many shows packed for several years now. And it's a delight to have them on the show this time. Tom and Andy, welcome.
Thanks for having us back.
Thank you, Ken. Happy to be back again, my friend.
Yep.
We're going to have a topic here, which I think will be very interesting. You might remember a while ago, actually, one of the most popular of the videos here on my channel was when I had one of my colleagues from Things We Said Today on, Alan Kozin, and we talked about what was the Beatles' creative peak as a band. And it's so much fun to talk about this because you can ask 10 people, they'll give you 10 different answers. Such is the case also with the solo careers of the Beatles. And especially when you're dealing with Paul McCartney, someone who has put out so much music in his career, Beatles and solo, I thought we'd do the same thing for him. So my question is going to be to these two gentlemen, and I'll give you my opinion. What has been the creative peak in the career of Paul McCartney, combining the Beatles and his solo career? It's a very difficult question because, as I said, he's been so prolific throughout his career. And when it comes to being creative, there's so many different things you could talk about. I tend to look at the songwriting aspect the most when it comes to Paul. But then there's also his vocals, writing with other people, his bass playing, his musicianship. You might want to combine that all into one, or you might just want to focus on the songwriting side. Everyone's different. So when you're thinking about Paul, was it the most prolific period of his time that really impressed you? And what was the most prolific? The more that you study this man, and I was just thinking, going back a few weeks ago, I was listening for the first time in a while to a bootleg from 1974, the piano tape, which is so fascinating to listen to, because there on the piano alone, he's not only playing new songs that he's going to release on Venus and Mars, he's got songs on there from London, well, what's going to be on London Town and Back to the Egg. So, you know, some of these songs have been percolating in Paul's brain for several years, and he's always coming up with material. So we could also ask the question, what matters more, when he was writing the most, or what you think his best material was, regardless of, it's a quantity versus quality thing as well.
Right.
So why don't we start with Andy and get your thoughts on what you think has been the greatest creative period. And by the way, this doesn't have to be 1 year. It could be a stretch of time. It could be several years all at once. It could be a decade if you wanted to.
Okay, I'm glad you clarified that, Ken, because I wasn't sure when you said peak. Is that 1 year? Is it one album? Could it be a span of years? And I'm glad you clarified that. And I'm really glad that you included the Beatle period too. I mean, I could have given you a block of time just for 1970 to now, but you know, you included the Beatle period. So I'm glad you did. And I think it's only logical that you did. And if I'm taking anybody's thunder, I'm sorry. You asked me to go first. So but I think Paul's most creative period, songwriting first, singing, bass playing, everything, but songwriting first. I'm going to go from 1966 until 1976. That 10-year gap, in my opinion, was when Paul was at his most prolific, most creative peak. That's Revolver, that's Pepper, that's, you know, the Magical Mystery Tour, White Album, Abbey Road, Let It Be, all the early Wings stuff, capping really at the height of Wings' success there with Venus and Mars and Speed of Sound, and really bookending it really with, you know, Wings Over America and the end of Wings really at their zenith, really. I mean, Wings was obviously much more successful. They made 2 more albums, But really, that period from 66 until 76, I don't think you would have found anybody more hot in popular music during that time period than Paul McCartney with what he was churning out. Lyrically, singing, bass playing, piano, melodies. I mean, I didn't even talk about Hey Jude or any other classics. I mean, think about that window of time.
Mm-hmm.
You're just taking 66 to 70, but then take 70 to 76. I mean, it's really, in my opinion, hard pressed to beat creatively and where he was at as a musician, and not to mention all, just the personal struggles that he went through at that time. The Beatles ending, starting over again, going through all that turmoil, getting himself help, having Linda help him, encourage him to start over again and be able and become the number one band really in the 70s again in that 10-year time period. I don't think, in my opinion, can't be matched. So that to me, that period is the creative peak for Paul McCartney.
Okay, very interesting what you said there. And, through all the work that the three of us do through our podcasts and all, we do very often bring up this whole idea that sometimes the best work that an artist does might not be the most successful work or the most commercial work. You might think that an album that didn't chart as high from Paul later on might be one of his best albums, whether it be Flowers in the Dirt or Flaming Pie. But you're looking at a period of time when Paul was dominating both the singles and albums charts with Wings in the very beginning of the 70s, and of course the last 4 years of the Beatles. So how do you differentiate sometimes when some of the best work, and I know you must feel that way too at some point, knowing all of Paul's catalog, some of his best work is stuff that didn't sell nearly as well when he wasn't at the top of the charts. So are you more influenced by the fact that this was his most successful time commercially, or are you really looking strictly at everything artistically?
I'm looking at everything artistically, not the commercial aspect. Artistically, I think artistically. He was. I could take Normal Lonely Nights or something from Press to Play. In fact, I had another answer prepared. If it was only going to be solo period, I would have taken probably some of the stuff in the 80s personally. But now that it encompassed his entire career, artistically, for me, I don't think that period can be beat. Forget about that it was his most successful commercial. I don't think it could be beat artistically, especially lyrically, and where he was at in terms of his vocals and ability and his bass playing ability during this time. Because it was so, especially in Wings.
Okay. And as you know, we've all expressed different opinions about his work. And very often it may not be what the general public thinks. There's been a lot of acclaim now for the early solo McCartney stuff, even pre-Ben on the Run. And a lot of people now are reappraising Wildlife and Red Rose Speedway in that period. But there'll always be some people who will say, Wildlife is one of his weakest albums. Wings to the Speed of Sound, which is an album that I love a lot. Don't get me wrong. It was number one for 7 weeks. And I love the fact that every member got a lead vocal on the album. But at the same time, you look at a lot of his later stuff that I would think is far superior to an album like that. So, these are all things that come into question for all of us anyway. Yeah.
But Tom, even still, you've got, even though that might be a lesser album, when you look at to your point, I got better albums since then, but even still, that album, has Let 'Em In and Silly Love Songs on it. So
sure. Beware My Love.
Beware My Love. So nothing really I know in terms of the zenith of Wings, it's not really remembered as one of the better albums, but it's still, like 7 weeks, number one, didn't do too bad there in 76.
Oh yeah. Okay. Tom, let me get your take on this.
Well, I tend to think like all artists, there's peaks and then there's lows, highs and lows in everybody's career. And I actually have a couple peaks here that are worth discussing. But like Andy, I tend to believe, that era, his years. But I've added one on the beginning and I added one at the end. I think his main creative peak lyrically, musically, artistically, instrumental wise, I think you have to start with 65 with Yesterday and then go to 77 with Mulla Kintyre. Even though, yes, those, from the bookends, even though that was probably his most successful in terms of commercial, I think it's also his most successful creativity wise as well, with being so influential with bass playing, so influential in songwriting and just in melody, with his ideas. I mean, he was having ideas every second. He was coming up with a #1 hit, whether it was here in the States or in the UK or any other country for that fact. And so for me, 65 to 77 for me would be the era where he was at his peak. And yes, we have to mention that it was also his most successful commercially, but that shouldn't take away the work that he did. I mean, when you're appealing to all mass audiences, something has to be said with that. I mean, that's what a lot of people think, that what he's putting out is very creative. If something, it sounds good to your ears, I guess, is that considered being creative as well? I mean, you're appealing to everybody at some point. And he did that in this whole period from 65 to 77, and I think that's something very special when you're able to, to appeal to so many people. And not only that, he's creating for other artists as well at this time. He's writing top 10 hits for Mary Hopkins and Badfinger, and he's producing them, and so giving songs to other people that they're having success with as well. So the ideas that he was spewing out during this whole span is just phenomenal. And I don't see how anybody was hotter than McCartney during this time. And that's nothing to take away from Lennon, because we all know Lennon is spectacular as well, and the stuff that he created. The Beatle days, let's look at what else he was doing for other people. His input to Ringo on playing the drums for Ticket to Ride. I mean, the creativity for that. We talk about the tape loops for Tomorrow Never Knows. We talk about his guitar solo for Taxman. We talk about he had the ability for when Ringo walked out. He had the during the White Album sessions, he had the creative ability to step in there and assume the drumming role. Not everybody can say that they can do something like that, and it's just and then he was just also having #1s to go with it, which was the cherry on the top, I guess. But I mean, besides Elton John for a small stretch of time, I don't think anybody was hotter than McCartney.
Well, you got a point there. You both do. And it's very hard. It's very hard to disagree with what you're saying there, and especially when you're talking about the Beatle days, as you said, Tom. Paul contributed so much for the other songs that the other Beatles wrote. So
A Day in the Life, again, to that, to that as well.
There's no way that you can dismiss that at all. So yeah.
No, and I've also felt, and Tom said 65, I said 66, and just a little bit of a side note, and I don't know if Ken will share this opinion, but I've always felt that the Beatles, in terms of how they were, their structure and the power struggle, it was in two phases. I've always felt that from 60, from the beginning of the Beatles when they were formed in 57 until about 66, 65, it was John's band. And then Paul really kind of became the focal point of the group's direction, really, and carrying it to the end. So I really so Tom said 65, I said 66, because I think clearly Paul was emerging as kind of, not as the dominant force, because it was always John's band and it always was going to be. But it just seems that the so much of the creativity aspect of the bands was driven from Paul from 66 on.
Right.
Really. And because it became, I always tell people, there's two phases to the Beatles career. John led it and got it going. And then Paul kind of picked up and took the reins when John kind of, was kind of, checked out mentally for a while and filmed How I Won the War, and Paul and Brian Epstein died and Paul took the reins. And that's kind of how I kind of view that period.
Right. Did you by any chance get to watch our show on Things We Said Today about misconceptions about the Beatles? Because we talked a little bit about this, and sometimes it bothers me when people think that Paul was the leader, in the second half of the Beatles. And I can understand, and what you're saying, Andy, is pretty much a lot what Alan Kozin was saying, because it's more than just the writing of the songs. Once you're looking at 1967 on, it's a bit more balanced between John and Paul and how much they wrote. A little bit more from Paul,
Yes.
and the singles tilted more in Paul's direction, even though John still had a lot of A-sides too. But
Yes.
but Paul was driving the band a lot after Brian died. The ideas came more from him. Sgt. Pepper, although that was before Brian died, Magical Mystery Tour, the idea of doing something for Get Back, Let It Be, that came from Paul. He really wanted the band to do something then. And it's easy to go off on a tangent here, as we often do. Because I always wonder if, because of the fact that Ringo had the Magic Christian to do, that Paul was worried that with more time away from being in the Beatles, that there would be less interest, and you had to keep working, to keep the band going. So, but and there's no doubt about it. You watch that Get Back documentary, and the ideas are pouring out of him. Like, there's so many songs, and many of them are still not finished or remain unreleased. So it's do you feel that, I hold the view that I've often felt that if the Beatles just took a little bit of a break after the White Album and didn't rush right back into Twickenham in January 69, things have been a little bit different. Do you think that it was unavoidable because of the Magic Christian being already booked? Well, I think it's unavoidable that the Beatles broke up, because no matter what, I think that John wanted to do more with Yoko, and that was one of the biggest reasons, along with Alan Klein, and the division in the Beatles as to who their manager would be. But there's just so many reasons, musical differences, whatever. But I can understand, the further and further you get away from, rehearsing, recording, there might have been some worry there on the part of Paul. George is hanging out with Bob Dylan. Now Ringo's involved with films. He had already done Candy, by the way. But, they're all doing different things. So the more that they're on their own doing things, then, it's tough to keep the band together and to keep them all unified, So, it was an amazing thing to watch Get Back, as everyone who's watch my podcast will know how I feel about it, because to see how they enjoy doing the rooftop concert, and you look at that band and you wouldn't think that 9 months later that John would say, I want out. But we all know that there were problems within the band, and they were surfacing more and more. But when the chips were down and they had to deliver something by the end of the month, they did, which makes that documentary so fascinating among the many aspects of it. But you raised a good point. What was the second period, Tom, that you wanted to bring up?
The second period for me would be 2005 to 2008. And we're looking at, Chaos and Creation up into Electric Arguments. For me, I think, and also including Memory Almost Full. Now not as successful in terms of sales and charts or whatnot, but these are three albums that I think that you see everybody talk about favorably. Especially the songs. You look at songs like How Kind of You, and the loops that he does in there, and Jenny Wren writing the Vanity Fair. Just to name a few from Chaos. The Vintage Clothes, That Was Me, and House of Wax. Just to name a few from Memory Almost Full. A lot of creative input. On those tracks as well. When I think of Electric Arguments, I think of Sun Is Shining, Universal Here, Everlasting Now, Nothing Too Much, Just Out of Sight. All as creative tracks that had that creative McCartney touch stamp on it. And and I don't think anybody would argue that was another creative high in McCartney's career. It just didn't have that cherry on the top in terms of commercially successful, which is fine too. I mean, that whole period that we talked about earlier, if that wasn't commercially successful, I would still consider that the highs of highs for Paul, because just the material is just so strong.
Yeah, well, it's hard to disagree, because well, when I proposed this idea to you guys, I thought it would be so simple for me, because I know in the back of my mind what I normally say, but if you really take the time to listen, especially to your comments, but there's no way you can avoid not bringing up the latter half of the Beatles era with all the brilliant songs that Paul wrote. And yeah, you can start with Yesterday, or even there's ones before that are great. And I love her. And, I saw her standing there, whatever. But Revolver was really that midpoint there where you got 5 songs from John and 5 songs from Paul, although Yellow Submarine was supposed to be more of a Paul song. But yeah, and then from then on, it was far more balanced between John and Paul. I don't think that Paul dominated the songwriting as much as John did in the early years through 65. But yeah, but his brilliance, what he added to Beatles recordings and the songs that he wrote at that time, his bass playing was off the charts. Listen to Sgt. Pepper, listen to Abbey Road. It's amazing the ideas that he came up with. Certain songs, especially when you listen now to isolated tracks, and you can do that online and listen to Hey Bulldog and what came out of his brain then.
Right.
But yeah, it's incredible just how creative he was in those, especially from 66 through 69 with the Beatles. And but for me personally, I do love that mid 80s period. The Press to Play, Flowers in the Dirt period, because also in between all that, you have the stuff he worked on with Phil Ramone. A lot of it still is unreleased. Songs he worked on with David Foster. And then to me, it's really, if I had to narrow it down, I would say everything from, say, that mid 80s period through Off the Ground. Because I love Flowers in the Dirt. It's my favorite McCartney album. I think he did brilliant work with Elvis Costello. I think he was a great songwriter, a great pairing between the two of them. I really think they were very ideal for each other. There's a big contrast in the songwriting styles, and the lyrics were far more intelligent, when Elvis Costello stepped in. Not that they weren't without him. And I love the songwriting. I love the songwriting with Eric Stewart on Press to Play. I like when Paul collaborates. I wish he would collaborate more, even though he's proven many times over he doesn't have to have a collaborator as a songwriter to put out great material. But when you think about this whole period of the mid 80s through Off the Ground, you also have to include the Liverpool Oratorio.
Absolutely.
Just to think that he was working on all that.
And yeah, just another dimension of his ability going into classical. Yeah.
Right. And Off the Ground, I think, was a very good album. Not as strong as the previous ones, but still has amazing stuff on there. But why are you snickering? as we probably have all talked about, there's so much great material from the Off the Ground sessions that he didn't put on the album, that he put on the CD singles. And if you look at it as a double album, it's extraordinary.
Yes.
So when you look at that, but I would also say that I really think that Paul's Renaissance period has been from press to play through today. Really, if you don't count what I consider to be, the albums where it was mainly covers, like the Russian album or Kisses on the Bottom.
Double Run.
It's interesting you hold that opinion, Ken, because a lot of people think that his Renaissance period really is from Flaming Pie on, not kind of like with Dylan, with Time Out of Mind to now. Both came out the same year. A lot of people think McCartney's Renaissance really is from Flaming Pie on. Interesting that you obviously you love Press to Play, so from Press to Play on, but a really great album. And then Flowers in the Dirt. I mean, all these are just tremendous albums. So I could see how somebody could say, well, really from that point on, really.
Well, I do think Flaming Pie is one of his best albums. I also think Chaos and Creation in the Backyard is one of his greatest albums, but I do think for the most part, what he's done in the 2000s, his albums have been really strong. If they're not great, they're certainly very good. And there's so much incredible material on all those albums. Memory Almost Full, New, Egypt Station, McCartney 3. The big difference in the last several decades is that unlike the 70s, where Paul released something every year, even the years when he didn't release albums, he still released a single or several singles, like 1972, 77, he released Mulligan Tire and Girl School. But, these days you got to wait 3 years, for a new McCartney album of original material. So you might say he's not as prolific as he once was, but at the same time, the quality of the music is really there.
Right. I tend to think that he could still possibly release an album a year if he really wanted to. Yeah, I mean, they might not be, they could probably range from good to great, but I still think he has that drive and the energy. I mean, if he wanted to, or if he had, obviously contracts being what they used to be to now, obviously, you can't, but I also think that he's also got, peaks, little peaks, I would consider, the 80 to 82 to be a small peak. I would consider, the Beatle anthology to Flaming Pie another small peak.
So what you're saying, when you're saying like 80 to 82, what you're really saying is that even though Tug of War came out in 82, the songs were written in those
81,
yeah.
Right. Like I've got down as like another personal peak. If we were going to just focus more, I mean, I've got like from 78 to 84 as another kind of peak for me. I mean, you've got Paul responding to punk. Okay, so creatively, he's channeling all of his, punk is the way back to the egg, right? Okay. Then he goes entirely experimental and locks himself in a way and does McCartney 2 and experiments, and he's influenced by Kraftwerk and a lot of these other bands that are out at the time with synths. And then John passes away, and then he has to deal with that, and then comes out with a fantastic stellar album, Tug of War. I mean, and then on top of that, wins an Ivor Novello for We All Stand Together in 84. So very, very incredible period of time with all kinds of different kinds of music in that period of time. So I've got that period as well as a favorite.
And there's also like a visual peak as well. I mean, let's talk about, visually, the video for Coming Up, the video for Pipes of Peace.
Sure.
I think you got to consider that in a creative peak as well. I mean, a lot of that stuff was his idea. Right. He just needed the help, to help bring those ideas to reality.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of funny that you mentioned that because, Pipes of Peace to me and Coming Up are extraordinary videos. I love Take It Away as a video.
Yeah,
I love Ebony and Ivory, but if you follow what was said in the Pipes of Peace archival box set, he was interviewed in there, and he said that he really hated the whole MTV period because a lot of people seemed to care more about the videos than they cared about the songs.
Right.
And that's true.
But I've seen a lot of crap videos that didn't have a lot of thought behind them. These had thought and thought behind them, and they were done very artistically.
Right. So even in a visual sense, musically, we all love the songs. Those are great songs. add a new video element into it, a visual aspect to it.
Mhm.
It even puts the cherry on the top for this period.
Right.
That's why I had it down in my notes as just another prolific period of a peak for me personally.
Right.
Mm.
Well, that's why I love having a topic like this, because there is no be all and end all answer here, because
No,
we could all come up with different periods and then explain why. And very
Right.
often, especially with what you learn with a book like Eight Arms to Hold You, or what you learn from these archival box sets, once you study something like, there you go, you guys are always ready. You take a look at something like Ram,
Right.
and then you realize all the songs that Paul was working on other than what ended up on Ram, and songs
Yes.
that were released later on, like Little Woman Love and I Lie Around.
Little Lamb Dragonfly.
Yeah.
Right.
And Get on the Right Thing, that all started
Right.
during Ram. So you look at an album and you can't just look at the songs that were on that album. You got to look at everything else that Paul was writing at the same time that ended up
same
years
time.
later.
Right. Well, to your point, Ken, I mean, the piano tape, he's hammering away on Million Miles and Mull of Kintyre, and even like a song like I'll Give You a Ring, Girlfriend,
Right.
which came out years later.
Mm.
You know, which is just so. Again, this time period of writing all these songs, which they came out years later, but there he is in '74, hammering away on a piano. And it's wonderful. We have that artifact to listen to it. These
Right.
ideas were floating around in his head at the time, and they came out to be great songs later.
Yeah, you got to look at the sessions as a whole. Absolutely, I agree with that 100%.
Yeah.
Same thing with Red Rose Speedway. I mean, you got to look at that that whole the whole album as a session, not necessarily an album, where you see what else was there, and then that showed up later on. Absolutely,
That's the great thing about these archival box sets.
Yeah.
But at the same time, sometimes it disturbs me in a way when people, if you're a new McCartney fan and you're buying the Red Rose Speedway box set and you're listening to it as a double album, whereas for the last
does that change it? Right.
50 years, I've heard it this one way. And yes, I knew all the other songs anyway from being on bootlegs or eventually being released. So they weren't new songs for me, but you have a totally different look at this album if you're presenting it as a double album to someone for the first time listening to it. So, so what's the right way to present the album?
What's the right way to present it? To a modern listener, take your phone and just program, the first 9 tracks on the playlist on Spotify and Apple Music for Red Rose Speedway, and don't listen to anything else. That's what you told them.
And then you've got something like McCartney 2, which was originally going to be a double album anyway.
Double album as well, yeah.
Right.
But the way it was presented on the archival box set, it's all the other stuff, but not necessarily in the order that it was going to be in the double album.
Right. You could take that McCartney 2 archive and you could build it yourself into what it was
supposed to be,
proposed to be, if you want to say that word instead of supposed. Because
and I've said this to Tom on our show before, and I'm listen. I don't know why the record company gave him so much crap about double albums when Yoko Ono could put out double albums, no problem. In the 70s, no problem. And there's some good ones, like Approximately Infinite Universe. That's a
excellent
good
album.
Right.
That's a very good album. It's a great album.
It's
Paul
probably
just
my
wants
favorite.
To put a double album out. Yeah, it's a great album. Paul wants to do a double album. Nah, you can't do it. Sorry.
Right.
You just see why that would burn him.
Right. And the double album really came alive during the 70s. I mean, that was, I think, the double album's peak right there. I mean, you look at all those great double albums throughout the 70s, and Paul doesn't have one where almost every session he went into, really, honestly, I would say probably 4 or 5 albums he did in the 70s probably could have been double albums.
Easily. So, I mean, obviously he gets the triple whopper with Wings Over America as a live one, but as a Frampton Comes Alive, same year, double album. I think Kiss, when was Kiss's live album, Tom?
That was 75, I want to say.
Right. So
you got all those Chicago albums.
Oh, the first three Chicago records were double, and then the fourth one was the live one.
Was the
the
live
triple
box set.
was a triple album. You know.
No,
That's
is it
like
a
unheard
quadruple?
of. Who else would
Is
start
it
a
a
career that
quadruple?
way?
It's 4.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So here's Paul just saying, look, I want to just put a double album out. Even that, nah, we can't do it. So you can understand his frustration.
They
You know,
probably
record
saw
companies
that
don't like
Wildlife didn't
Yeah.
perform as well as they wanted it to. So maybe they were erring on the side of caution. But like you said, and I've said it too, Yoko Ono could put out a double album, and
Right.
she wasn't selling, a lot of records, not many.
No.
I wish she did, but
Right, but come on, like, so hey, listen, we have the reconstructed double one now for Red Rose
Right.
Speedway, and make it however you like.
when it comes
Yeah.
to being creative, do you think Paul is his most creative when he just experiments, like the McCartney 2 or these, DIY albums of his, or the Fireman? Do you admire him more when he experiments? Because there's so many different ways of looking at it. I know that, and I bring up Press to Play all the time, there are a lot of people who look at that particular period as Paul jumping on the bandwagon of, a lot of techno
80
stuff, heavy drums,
80s production,
you know,
Pajam stuff.
cashing
yeah.
in on that period, or do you admire him for trying to do something different for himself?
I admire him for the experimental thing. I mean, look, he realistically he does something like that almost on every album. I mean, you look at like Band on the Run, you got Picasso's Last Words, very experimental. You look at London Town, More Spooks than the Grey Goose, again, experimental.
Always
So,
experimental.
I mean, for that, I mean, it seems like, you'll have your love songs, you'll have your rockers, and then you'll have your experimental bit. So, and that's one of the things that I really appreciate with his albums is they're all over the map. It's not just, whole lot of love, throughout the whole,
Right.
throughout the
whole
whole
album.
album, which again, Led Zeppelin 2 is one of the greatest albums of all time. But it's which does have, it's different stuff on there, but it's something different. And then, and again, like the Beatles, almost every album sounds different than the last. That's a sign of a great creator, a great artist.
Well, a lot there
opinion.
depends upon what your ears hear.
Right.
I'm sure there's
yeah.
a lot of Led Zeppelin fans who think one album is different from the other, or see a progression in some way.
Right.
I've often said that, where McCartney is concerned, he did develop a signature sound with Wings, even though the fourth and fifth members changed. The Paul, Linda, and Denny sound. I don't see there being that big a difference between, say, Band on the Run and Venus and Mars, as an album. Venus and Mars might have a little bit more of an R&B feel to it with stuff like Call Me Back Again. But, chances are, if you like Band on the Run, you're going to like Venus and Mars. If you like Red Rose Speedway, you're going to like Band on the Run.
Right. I've often felt that when Paul has been pushed into a corner and faced with a lot of, crisis, or there's been something going on, that has spurned a masterful album. And the three that I'm going to cite are Band on the Run, Tug of War, and Flowers in the Dirt. I think when obviously Band on the Run, the making of Band on the Run, the pressures that came with that album, delivered it, knocked it out of the park. Tug of War goes without saying. Flowers in the Dirt, I think too, also faced with the crossroads. Now, Press to Play, we all three of us love that record, but clearly he wasn't happy with the results that it yielded, and got together with Costello and crafted a wonderful album from start to finish. Sorry, Tom, I know you hate Mother of Love, but I like it. So I think with those three albums, when Paul is pushed into a corner, emotionally, or rather responding to negative criticism of his work in the press, has, with those three albums as an example, delivers every time, I think. So when he's pushed to the max, he delivers, whether it's emotionally or whatever he happens to be going through with wherever the band was at the time, or he was going through at the time.
You feel that way, Tom?
Yeah, a little bit. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I tend to think that may be over, maybe over dramatized a little bit. If he's, when he's, obviously he's put in a corner and he's gotta, come up with something great.
Not that he has to. It just happens. It just happens.
A little bit. Yeah, I can see your point, Andy, but I tend to think that he can put an album, a great album together without being stressed.
John Lennon once said Lennon once said to the press, he said, "Paul will make a good album when he's scared to." And that was his feelings then. I mean, I would argue that if John was with us today and looking back on Paul's career, I think he would have a change of heart. I think he would probably love an album like Ram, to be honest with you. Yes.
I think he would probably admire an album like Wildlife today if you're looking back on it, so
it's tough to say.
Sure.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, it's all speculation right now,
right.
Unfortunately, and that's, a lot of what we're doing right now is, is opinions and speculating. But, what I really feel bad for is the people that will say that Paul hasn't done anything great since Wings, or he hasn't done anything good since Tug of War or Flaming Pie. I only like the Wings sound. I really feel bad for those people because they're really missing a lot from Paul, especially come the 2000s. Yeah, Driving Rain, as much as we may like it, but the public generally gives it crap, and that's fine. But I really feel bad for those people, because maybe they're not giving an album like Chaos a chance, or New a chance, or even the new album, McCartney 3 a chance. They just want to remember Paul, in his 70s sound, in his most, successful period. I like to also say that I really get annoyed by people who say that they're a fan of a particular artist, and I'll play a deep cut from a particular artist, and they'll say, well, who's that?
Yeah.
Well, that's the artist you just said you loved, and he goes, oh, well, I just like the hits, and just like, just, you don't know what you're missing. You really don't.
How many times have I said the same thing about people, like where Paul is concerned, where they'll say, he hasn't really done anything good since the 70s or whatever. And then I'll say, well, what did you think of Press to Play or Flowers in the Dirt? And they'll say, what's that?
Right.
So it tells me that they didn't really give it a chance in the first place. And if you don't really take the time to listen, you're not really qualified to say anything. I'm not expecting everyone to love everything that the man's done, but you have to give it a certain amount of time and let it sink in and get to know the music before you can judge it. But see, I agree pretty much what you were saying there, Tom, and to a certain degree what you were saying, Andy. I think sometimes when Paul is pressured, he can put out some of his best work. That after John Lennon died, all eyes were going to be on Paul and what he had to say about it. Was he going to write a song about John at all? And he delivered. And he delivered a great album. So I think he took the time. He didn't rush the album. He really made it as perfect an album as he could with Tug of War. And there are those moments when you can feel that throughout his solo career. I do love Flaming Pie, and I think that's a real high moment in his career. But I don't know if he was necessarily backed into a corner at that time.
No.
He did have the Beatles anthology very hot at the time, and the Beatles doing very well. And the sales of Flaming Pie benefited from the success of the Beatles anthology.
I think he just put more pressure on himself for that record. Coming off of this, this great high of
the Beatles anthology.
I think he put the pressure on himself more or less, because all eyes now, are on the Beatles again and what they're releasing. And, here he is putting out an album, and
he didn't have to. He didn't have to release Flaming Pie. The record company didn't need an album from him.
Well, not during the release of Anthology. I think, 2 years later, I think it was fine. I think they just didn't want to release it during the whole the Anthology machine was still going.
Going, sure.
Well, it was still like a year after the anthology with Flaming Pie.
Oh,
So
well
and
after,
still you had a gap there between Off the Ground and Flaming Pie of 4 years.
4 years,
So that's a
which
long time.
Yeah, but
very
he's
long
still
time.
releasing stuff. I mean, he's still putting out a live album. He's still putting out the first
Right.
First
Fireman
Fireman
album.
album.
He's still putting, well, he's putting out Standing Stone. So he is
Mm,
putting stuff out.
right.
It's
But
just
I'm
not
talking,
the Paul McCartney moniker.
yeah, I think by and large, even though there are fans out there that will buy everything, the Firemen, every scrap that the man writes and releases,
You mean
but
a leaf? You're gonna buy a leaf too?
yes, a leaf.
Right.
By and
A
Yes.
leaf,
large,
which is also doing.
I think most people take a look at, his pop albums of original material.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's what they look at as his main catalog. So
Right.
yeah, um, it's an incredible catalog that he's given us throughout his entire career, and I love hearing different opinions all about this.
Right.
No doubt
I think
about it.
depending on who you ask and what day of the week, somebody might say Tom said, the chaos to fireman period from 05 to 08. I mean, that it all depends on what your interests are. I mean, somebody
Right.
might say that their peak is
I would, in a perfect world, I would love to say from 62 to 2020. You know what I mean? Because I mean, this guy is capable of being that creative. We found that out early on during the Beatles' career, that this guy was capable of this greatness. And unfortunately, though, I mean, you get those low points where maybe you're just not as interested in it as other people, but that album that you might not be interested might be an album that somebody might think is
Right.
creative, like we talked about with Ken, with Press to Play to
right. But the
Flowers
way history has been written and will be
Right.
probably told is that Paul McCartney had a lull in the 1980s. That's
Right.
what's going to be the accepted history.
Well, that could
Unfortunately,
change.
Right.
hopefully it
That's
does.
that's what we talk about here on our podcast,
Right.
is the fact
Right.
that over time, opinions can change about specific
Yeah.
songs, specific albums. Like, we bring up all the time the early McCartney stuff
Right.
now, the DIY albums
Yeah.
that are respected.
Right.
I
I would not be surprised if and when we get a Press to Play archive that it gets reevaluated favorably. I mean, all of a sudden people will call it an 80s masterpiece, and I know you
Right.
don't like to, say things are dated, Ken, but I just have a feeling that that's how that will be perceived.
Well,
once it gets its re-release.
we've talked about this stuff so many times about
I know.
what's considered
Right.
dated. I mean, the sound of the 80s, you might be able to find a band or a few bands today that sound like their music could have been done in the 80s.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Some people think disco music is dated. There's a lot of dance
Mhm.
music out there today that sells really well. I don't know how the public's
Right.
going to be looking at this work years later. Nobody really knows. It's like I say, nobody has a crystal ball, but
Right.
it's very possible if all of a sudden, Ram is looked at as being this masterpiece that could
Right.
be, in the eyes of many McCartney fans, his best album. Who's to say
Right.
10 years from now or 50 years from now that Press to Play won't be? It all depends upon the music of that time, what young people discovering the Beatles and their solo music might think. A lot of the stuff that Paul was doing in the 80s might sound completely fresh at that time.
Right.
Nobody really knows for sure.
Yeah.
And there is this thing that I brought up with Tom. I don't know if I've brought it up with you, Andy, but I do believe very strongly in most people, not everyone, that it's the music that you hear from your adolescence, teenage years, and in your 20s that will always have the greatest impact on your life. And for most people, they have 1 or 2 decades that are that's their favorite time in music. I mean, my parents were born in the 1920s, and they always point to the 30s and 40s as their era.
Right.
And nothing will ever be better than that music.
Right.
I don't want to take anything away from that. People who grew up in the 60s as teenagers, the 60s are their period, and nothing can ever touch it. And
it's funny you brought that up. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, finish.
You've told me about your dad, and the fact that he loves the Beatles, he loves Wings, and it stops there. For a lot of people, it's 2 decades That's it. And they
Yeah.
stop listening to new music, or if they do listen to new music, it doesn't have the same impact as you get older.
No.
Right. And
So-
it's like that that article that was going around over the weekend where the guy gave the review of the Beatles and the Ed Sullivan Show and how he felt that Ed Sullivan wasted his time.
Right.
It's just fun. The generation before always complains about the next generation's music or whatever. But it's funny because I really try lately. I've been really trying to discover new music, and I find stuff that I really like and to really love. But instead of constantly getting to know that better and better, I keep going back to those, like you say, those 20 years of music.
Right. Yeah, like
that
you listen
really
to it,
impacted my life.
You try something out, you listen to it,
Right.
you go, I like it, but I'm not gonna, you listen to it to try it out, and unless
Right.
it really grabs you, you're like, okay, I listened to it. Now I'm going back into that.
Right.
I'm putting that old sweater back on that I like, that feels comfortable, and I'm going back to my safe place to listen to the music that I know. It's just natural for people like us, I suppose.
Well, let me tell you something, Tom. Several years ago, you asked me, there was this big craze on Facebook, name your top 10 favorite albums of all time. And a lot of people were doing it. And you got me to do it. And I never stopped to think what they would be. I would know what my top 2 or 3 would be automatically, but I never wrote down top 10 or top 40 or anything. So I went through my entire music collection. And even though during the week, I listen to a considerable amount of new music because I want to. I want to hear something that's going to excite me. And I don't claim to be an expert on today's new music, but yet here I am. I put together my top 10. 9 of the 10 were from the 60s or 70s.
Right.
And that's with all my listening of new music. It doesn't mean today's music is bad, but if I was a teenager now listening to today's music, and let's just say I'm listening to today's rock, because I don't really care about the hits of today. I'm not really big into that. But the rock of today, that could be the biggest music of my lifetime.
Right.
That's just how it is. I only had one album of the 80s, and that was Flowers in the Dirt. Everything else was from the 60s or 70s. And that's with someone who listens to a lot of new music. Elton's in there. That first Elton album. Well, the one with your song. That's my favorite.
Oh, the self-titled. I was
self-titled.
Not Empty Sky.
No,
not Empty
well,
Sky.
it's I
the
know.
first US US album.
That's what I consider his first album. My No Empty Sky came out first, but yeah, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road is in my top 10. But a lot of most of it is 70s, a little bit of 60s, and that's what's impacted my life. And I think most people are that way. If you actually stop and take the time and put together your own top 10, you'd be surprised how most of that music is from, at the most, a 20-year period. It could be a 10-year period.
Less.
So that has a way of coloring your judgment of newer music, whether it's new artists or whether it's new music from veteran artists.
Not that you openly dislike it. It's just, and I listen. There's a couple new artists that I like, and I'll listen to a couple of their songs, but that's it. You go back to the same period of music that you enjoy. It's only natural. Not that I don't dislike it, but it's not going to crack that.
Right.
It's not going to crack that vault of music that is impenetrable. It's just not gonna.
It's just fortunate that for people like us, and that we're only talking Beatles here, we take the time to listen to everything new that they've done. So, because we still have this massive interest. And I'm still just as curious today as I was when I was a teenager, what Paul McCartney's doing now, what Ringo Starr is doing now, and all the archival stuff from the others and the Beatles stuff. So, but all these different reasons, this is how people form their opinions. And like I said, I like hearing all these different opinions that you guys have brought during this hour. And these are all incredible periods of time. I don't, there are times I could justify any period that you're talking about.
Right.
You know,
Any period you could.
I could say
you want to justify 1974 for Paul? Go ahead, justify it. Yeah.
No,
But-
but look, you got a good point. I mean, you could take an album like Broad Street and you could find creative moments, you know, in that period, you know, but it's not like on the say par as maybe the, you know, a tug of war or maybe a flaming pie. I mean, but there's still creative moments in there. It's just not as a whole. It might not be as creative as say, you know, a Rubber Soul or Revolver, you know, that he did, or Band on the Run.
Right.
It all depends. I'm very much affected by how prolific he can be all at one time. And if you look at that mid 80s period through the end of the 80s, and again, you have to include all that stuff with Phil Ramone. A lot of that music I love a lot, you know, and Press to Play and Flowers in the Dirt. Yeah, you had the Russian album, which doesn't count really, as far as I'm concerned. It's nice to have that in there. And everything else that I mentioned, the Liverpool Oratorio, Off the Ground, up through 93.
The best, one of the best singles he ever released, Once Upon a Long Ago and Back on My Feet.
Okay, I think that's a brilliant song. Yeah.
Right.
So, all right. Any final thoughts on this, guys? Anything that we haven't covered?
I think you could, I mean, we picked our periods here, but I think just from our conversation, you could pick any era and define it based on, if you think it's a peak, based on what your habits are. I mean, I think generally we're pretty much on the same page for the eras that I think we agree on, but it could be anything. It could be any period of any of those 52 plus years of McCartney's career. That could be a peak. I mean, generally, I think we're all on the same page of where we think it should be, but it could be any period of his music, because it's so diverse and so different, as you pointed out. You know, the experimental stuff, the classical stuff, everything that he's done, the film work, the videos, everything. Anything could be a peak. But if we had to narrow it down, I think our choices were pretty on point for what we like.
All right, one last question, because very often I bring up the fact that in the 70s, for the most part, Paul produced himself.
Yeah.
With the exception of Chris Thomas on Back to the Egg and George Martin here and there. But once he started working with other producers, I think they had more of an effect, I think, on his music and the recordings than maybe some of the musicians that he worked with at the time. Do you think that Paul is more creative when he goes beyond the band element, working with the same musicians all the time and working with changing to different musicians and working with different producers?
Right. Yeah, I think you're onto something there. I think that's I think that could be its own show right there. You know,
and it might be
when Paul came back to produce himself for McCartney 3, I think it proved that his instincts were still really, really good. I think he's a great producer, and I think he's proved himself a great producer, whether he's producing himself or other acts. And I think, you know, maybe, you know, when you bring in somebody else, I mean, I think he was very successful with George Martin, but when you bring in other people, like maybe like a Phil Ramone or the other producers that for Flaming Pie, and like Julian Mendelsohn, I think, you know, you get an ideas clash in a way. I think, you know, you might get a yes guy, or you'll get someone that challenges him.
That's good.
That's good. Yeah.
That's good.
But also, I think, you know, Paul knows, I think he knows his material better than anyone. And I think that, you know, producers that work with him should give him that space maybe to create. And then, you know, when the product's finished, then maybe they can give their 2 cents in.
Right, but when they've challenged him, he doesn't like that, and he'll ask. So he said to Padgett.
Oh yeah. When did you write your last number one?
When was your last number one? So I mean, do you want to be around yes men all of your life? I think it's good to have somebody be honest with him and say, "That's crap. Do it again." And George Martin was the only person who could tell him that, and he would respect it.
Well, he would respect it, but look, they still went Hugh Padgham's way anyways there during that Press to Play album. I mean, you look at those demos, you know, when it was just him, Eric, and Murata. I mean, it's a completely different sounding record.
Right. But to Ken's question, I think it's better if he has somebody to sound off of, whether that's other producers, other band members.
I don't know.
I think, listen, he's always going to be great. He produced himself in the 70s. It's classic. I don't disagree, but as time has marched on his career, resting on those laurels, I think I think it's good to have some fresh ideas and young. And look at what he did with New by having 4 different producers on that record. I think that benefited that record
Right.
by having more people.
Yeah, maybe.
Same
but
thing
then I
with
think,
Flowers in the Dirt. Many producers there.
Yeah.
Right, Steve Lipson,
Right.
Trevor Horn, all those
Right.
guys. Right.
Yeah, it's really a little bit of both, because instinctually he's a great producer. But I think
Yeah.
if he didn't use other producers, once we're getting into the 80s, his sound might get stale. You know,
Right.
it's very important to keep working with different people. So, you know, I can understand, you know, artists who want to move on, work with different people instead of always working with the same members and the same band over and over again. In a way,
Right.
Wings was kind of interesting because they changed the 4th and
Right.
5th members a lot.
Right.
You know, if it
Yeah.
had stayed the same group as the first lineup, and don't get me wrong, I love all those musicians, but it may have gotten stale at some point.
Right.
And
Yeah.
you know, I think it was important that Paul reaches out. Usually it's to a hot producer of the time, which could backfire sometimes, you know, but I think he only works with people whose work he admires. And
Right.
in some ways they show a direct influence in the final product of what he does. And I just think that it's better for an artist to keep working with different people over and over again, whether it's
Right.
musicians or producers. So I think
Agreed.
that's one of the reasons why, as much as I love his 70s output, I love the whole Wings era. I like when he works with
Right.
different people.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, and I think too, I feel like when he's producing himself, a lot of times he's, leading and not necessarily following trends. I think he's creating trends. And then to come in the 80s, once we got, maybe past Tug of War, and then we got to maybe Pipes of Peace and, and on, I think maybe he's following trends rather than being that, innovator in creating trends himself, which is up for debate as well.
Yeah, well, that was a major criticism of him working with Hugh Padgham,
Right.
or, even though I don't look at Goodnight Tonight as a disco song, a lot of people thought
Right.
that he was embracing, the dance market
Right.
then, which he was.
Right.
But then there are people who
Or-
applaud that,
Mhm.
Right. Or collaborating with megastars like Michael Jackson and Stevie
Right.
Wonder, just to get yourself a little more, so there's that criticism too.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, debates will continue.
Yes,
So
right.
that's what this is all about. And we'd love
Yep.
to know, to all of you listening and watching to this, what your thoughts are on this subject.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
can always
Yep.
write to us here on the YouTube channel. You guys want to talk about Two Legs, what you have coming up?
What do we got coming up, Andy?
Another show.
Right. Yesterday we posted our latest show. This is what, Sunday the 20th? Is it?
20th of
Yeah.
February.
Yeah, 20th February. We posted a chat that Annie and I did regarding the Unplugged album and MTV appearance. Today, which is Sunday the 20th, I'm really happy with the show we just recorded today. We had Owen Ling, who is a recurring guest on your show as well,
Right.
Ken. And for the first time, we had Adrian Sinclair from, as we know, from the McCartney Legacy book. And we talked about the track Live and Let Die. We talked about some myths. We talked about some other things regarding the creation of that song. And I can't wait for everybody to hear that episode. I'm really happy how that came out. So Adrian is chained to the room there. He's just like Mark Lewis, and we're trying to keep him and Adrian busy to keep these books coming. And I don't doubt that McCartney Legacy is going to be the be all to end all books on McCartney, and definitely the McCartney book that all McCartney fans deserve, for sure.
Yeah, I
So,
can't wait.
yeah.
I can't wait for volume 1, which comes out October
Right.
15th.
October
Me-
15th
Yep.
as of now. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good
Me-
chat. It was a good chat. Yeah, really good chat with those guys again.
Yeah.
Maybe
And
those two guys will do for McCartney what Mark Lewison is doing for the Beatles.
for the Beatles, right? Well, I mean, they are doing some myth busting, just like Lewison was doing. I mean, we talked about, you know, that whole conversation that George Martin had with Harry Saltzman. You know, whether or not the song was a demo or not, or whether or not that someone else was supposed to sing the song or not. You know, so we had that whole conversation. You know, when did Paul actually read the novel Live and Let Die? You know, which was actually pretty interesting as well. So there's that, and you'll be able to see that on the February the 26th. That's when you'll be posted, and you can watch the video part of it if you subscribe to Two Legs, a Paul McCartney podcast, and you know, check us out there. We're like, I think 926 subscribers right now. We're getting close to 1,000, and we're going to have a big 1,000 subscriber giveaway contest once we hit 1,000, and we're going to be giving the recently released Wings Wildlife Half-Speed Master and the red vinyl for the McCartney album that came out back in 2017. So we have those two little goodies to give away for when that occurs.
Okay.
So that's what's going on so far. Yeah.
In my description box, there will be the link to your YouTube page.
Yep.
And
thank you.
Yeah, and don't forget, by the way, Tom is my co-host on Talk More Talk.
Yes,
yes,
we should forget that.
You know, and you can watch us every 2 weeks on our YouTube channel every Monday at 9 p.m. Eastern. And every 2 weeks we talk about the Solo-Beatles. Once in a while it's about the group, especially with all the Get Back talk. And yeah, and you just mentioned over 900 subscribers. I just made it to over 800.
800? Yeah, you're coming along nicely, man.
Yes.
That's
So
awesome.
Nice. Very good job, Ken.
Yeah.
Well, thanks to everyone watching this channel and to all the new subscribers and old ones too. And if you haven't subscribed to Two Legs yet, please do that as well. And Talk More Talk. Okay.
And Talk More Talk. Yeah.
So thanks.
You know,
so
I
much.
often okay, sorry about that.
Go ahead.
No, it's just like I often think about, you know, when I messaged you about, you know, this whole, you know, Solo Beatles thing, and you know, and you know how it came to be, and just how grateful I am that you know, we were able to you know, with Kit and Ken Womack first to put that together, and just the fun that I've had with the whole experience. So
yeah, well, you were still are a major fan of things we said today. You used to listen,
Yep.
still do.
Oh,
to the
still
show.
do.
And and you used to call me up when I was doing the live broadcast of my weekly show, Every Little Thing.
Yeah.
And then from there, that led to us doing Talk More Talk together. So
absolutely. Yeah.
One thing leads to another.
That's there you go. Who did that song? One thing leads to another. The Fix. There you go.
The 80s.
Very good.
The best decade. No, I'm for some of us. No, actually, I do love the 80s, but the 70s are my favorite. But anyway, thanks so much to all of you for watching. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Tom.
Yep.
And
thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.